The Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know that he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying in the bed, and the demon had gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. And then he looked up to heaven, he sighed, and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. So we took a group of kids to Houston this summer. As many of you have already heard, for our ELCA National Youth Gathering. And even though this wasn't on the schedule, our high school youth really wanted to go visit NASA, the NASA Space Museum. And they bugged me about it over and over and over again. They even enlisted other people to help convince me that we should go to NASA. I got a text message one of those evenings from my boss, Pastor Kathy, saying, "So, have they talked to you? Have they talked to you into visiting NASA? It seems I have received a few text messages asking me to persuade you." And as if that wasn't enough, they started a petition at our Synod Day, where all of our Synod churches from across the Northern Illinois Synod gathered, and they got just a couple signatures. I even framed them. I was so proud of the kids. I think the bishop's signature might be on here. I'm not sure. Well, finally, I got so sick of it, I told them, every time you say the word NASA, I'm going to replace it in my head with the word Jesus. And so, when they came to me and said, "Can we go to NASA?" I would say, "We don't need to go to Jesus, because Jesus comes to us." It was a pastor moment. I had to do it. But I'll tell you, they wore me down. And so on the last day, we told them that we were going to go to our closing worship, but we actually skipped the worship so that we could go visit NASA. I'll tell you, as a pastor, that made me feel a little bit guilty until the kids reminded me that since NASA equals Jesus, really we were going to go visit Jesus. So, there were two main things that I took away from our visit to NASA. Okay, and the first was that it made me stop and think. It made me stop and think about God's ever-expanding universe and this wonder of God's creation of space, right? Thinking about God's ever-expanding universe. And the second thing NASA made me consider was the possibility And this might sound silly, but it always makes me think about the possibility of life outside of our planet. The idea that God did not make the earth the center of all life in the universe. So I always find myself to be a little awed and a little scared by both of these propositions. And part of me likes the idea that God made us special and that we have a unique place in God's plan for life in the universe. And this idea that God has created life elsewhere, possibly in an incomprehensibly large sea of space, that God might have a plan for life outside of our planet that He didn't even bother to tell us about, kind of makes you feel a little threatened, a little small sometimes. Now, all that's very theoretical, but here's where it gets real. To me, what this gets at is our human tendency to want to keep God to ourselves, to keep God in our own little corner of the universe. That we imagine God to be a part of our group, our church, our community, our country, but not really one of those outside groups. It's the ultimate question of insiders and outsiders. How big does God's universe get? How far does it expand? Now, in many ways, that's what our gospel story is about today. There's stories about insiders and outsiders. There's stories designed to expand our understanding of God's universe. There's stories about how God's love is revealed to be bigger than most people had ever really thought or imagined. So in the story today, Jesus, He finds Himself, He's traveling outside of His comfort zone, let's say, and he's traveling to a Gentile city, a non-Jewish city called Tyre. And when he gets there, a Greek woman, a Syrophoenician woman, it says, a Greek woman, a mother, falls at His feet and begins to beg Jesus that He heal her sick daughter. Now, something to know here is that for Jewish people, right, God's covenant was with them. And this, by the way, not a Jewish problem. This is a human problem, right? But we're speaking in a Jewish context, right? And so, in other words, you've got this close-knit group of people who understand really that God's promises are for them and not for anybody else, certainly not for the Gentiles. And so when this Greek woman, this Gentile woman, approaches Jesus here, He speaks to her from this old understanding of the universe, right? And His words are a little harsh. He tells this woman, begging for her daughter, He says, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Now, I think we have to give Jesus a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here. I think He knew how this Greek woman would respond, and I think He said that for the benefit of lifting people out of that mindset, actually. Right? That He was actually giving space for this Greek woman to bring the gospel. This woman outside of the Jewish tradition to bring the good news to the people. And so in some respects, that's what this story is doing. Right? It helps us zoom out and see this bigger scope of God's love. So regardless of what you think of Jesus' words here, credit to this Greek woman, because her reply is one of beautiful faith. She tells Jesus, and she brings this gospel. She says, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." I like her. I admire this woman for her courage and for her faith. She approaches Jesus as an outsider, but she tells Him, even as an outsider, that she belongs at God's table. And her claim to Jesus is that her sick daughter is no less deserving of God's healing love than that of an insider. And so the not so surprising thing here is that Jesus agrees. He heals this woman's daughter and he sends her home. What does that tell us? It tells us that God's love is always expanding. It's bigger and it extends to more people than we ever thought or imagined. Where the Jews used to think it only belonged to them, we learn through Jesus that it belongs even to the Gentiles. And as Christians, let's ask that question of ourselves. As Christians, does God's love and grace and mercy belong only to my group or my church or my community or my country, or does it belong to something bigger? Is God's love still expanding? It wasn't that long ago that LGBTQ people were considered way outside of God's reach. Go back a little further, it might have been people of color, people from different religious denominations. It wasn't that long ago that Swedes and Norwegians didn't get along. When my Grandpa Farrell, a Swede, married my Grandma Martha, a Norwegian, there were whispers. But as time has gone on, we've realized that God's universe is truly bigger than we ever thought before. That God's love is always expanding is good news to us, because it means that we are never outside of God's reach. That no matter how bad we mess up and no matter what corner of the universe we might try to run to get away from God, that God's love will find us always through His Son's death and resurrection on the cross. So in life and in death, on this planet or the next, God's love extends to us all. And for this we say, thanks be to God. Amen.